let me just say something about Deepa. She's an associate professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers. There's actually two of her articles are on the table over there in the ISR, International Social Review, both on Islam and Islamophobia topics that we'll be discussing tonight. So without further delay, here's Deepa.
Well, thank you all for coming out under tornado watch conditions. There was a tornado watch in Brooklyn and in Queens and so forth, so thanks for braving it. Hopefully it's worth it. So today what I want to focus my comments on is the controversy generated by the proposed Islamic Center in downtown Manhattan, because I think that reveals a lot, not just about the status of Islamophobia in the US today, but also the status of politics in general in the United States today. And what I wanted to try to do is actually just step back from the debate and the controversy, which I'm sure you've all been, reading about and you all have thoughts and opinions about, but just step back for a second and try to think of the project on its own terms. And I'm going to lay that out for you. Last year, Imam Rauf and his wife Daisy Khan put forward the project of building an Islamic community center that they call Cordoba House in downtown Manhattan. And it was by the way, Imam Rauf, for those of you who don't know, has served in this area for the last 25 years. And so their plan was essentially to put forward this project called Cordoba House. What is Cordoba House? Well, in essence, it was a plan for a community center called Park 51, which was modeled on the 92nd Street Y, right? People know the YMCA, it's now called the Y, and the Jewish Community Center in Manhattan. And the idea was not only to create more prayer space for Muslims. There's a great demand for more prayer space, and that simply speaks to the fact that Muslims have always been a part of not only New York but downtown New York, if not for decades and certainly for centuries as well. So there was a need for more prayer space, but in addition to that, they were going to try to initiate a process where Jews, Christians, and people of all different religions could come to a community center and meet Muslims and develop a greater understanding of Islam and of the Muslim community. So that was the vision. And how are they going to go about trying to achieve this? Essentially, if you go to the websites, right, go to Cordoba Initiative, go to Park 51, and you read and listen to everything that Imam Rauf and Daisy Khan have said, what they had in mind was to build a community center with recreational facilities, right? Things like a swimming pool, a gymnasium, and a basketball court. The center would also have a restaurant and a culinary school. It would have an art studio and exhibitions of various sorts, a 500-seat auditorium where people could hold all sorts of meetings and forums and so forth, a library, a childcare center, and so on and so forth. And a part of this project involved keeping prayer space aside, not only for Muslims, but also for people of other faith. And so the vision really was to get people of all stripes together to mingle with one another, right? To swim in the pool, to talk about diaper rashes, to attend the art exhibitions, to play basketball, etc., etc. You get the idea. And in this way, people who don't normally encounter Muslims would get to see that Muslims are just like anybody else. They're just as complex as anybody else. They have, there are people with different tastes, with different talents, different views, different outlooks, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at the project just on its own terms, who on earth could possibly have anything against it, right? That's the question we have to start with, because this is such a benign and non-controversial project that, frankly, to me, anyone in their right mind wouldn't object to it. But that's actually what the status of this project was back in December of 2006, when the New York Times wrote a front-page article on December 6th, I believe, on this proposed community center. So the article begins by saying that, there are Muslims who are already praying in the, the Burlington Coat Factory building, which is not being used and so forth. And I'll quote directly from the article. It says, "The building has no signs that hints at its use as a Muslim prayer space, but these modest beginnings point to a far greater vision. An Islamic center near the city's most hallowed piece of land would stand as one of Ground Zero's more unexpected and striking neighbors." So there's, a little bit of anxiety here. But then the article goes on to say the location was precisely a key selling point for the Muslims who bought the building in July. A presence so close to the World Trade Center, quote, where a piece of the wreckage fell, unquote, said Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, the cleric leading the project, quote, sends the opposite statement of what happened on 9/11. We want to push back against these extremists, added Imam Faisal. Okay, and I'll stop quoting the article there. In other words, there's a sort of muted anxiety in a sense that maybe the community center shouldn't be built, but because it had, overwhelming support, and certainly the support of Mayor Bloomberg and all the politicians and so forth, including Joy Levitt, who's been, centrally involved in this project. Joy Levitt is the executive director of the Jewish Community Center and so on. Because there was all of this support, the story actually has an overall tone that is positive, that says that the center should be built. Now, this is back in December, right? Early December. December 21st, Daisy Khan does an interview on Fox News with Laura Ingraham. People may know Laura Ingraham. She is an out-and-out conservative. I don't want to go through her credentials. You can Google her. All I'll say is that she was once engaged to be married to Dinesh D'Souza. And for those of you who know who he is, enough said. Now, at any rate, if you watch this 5-minute interview, the tenor of the interview is actually, it made me somewhat uncomfortable, and I'm sure it'll make you uncomfortable as well, because Ingram actually expresses all the prejudices that would then sort of frame the debate going forward. She says, first of all, the segment begins with an insert at the back which says Ground Zero Mosque, right? So that starts all the way back in December. And then she echoes all the arguments, Saudi Arabia doesn't allow you to build churches, they don't tolerate Christianity in the Middle East, apparently even in Lebanon, and in Iran, and Iraq, and so on. So that sort of line of argument. And Daisy Khan responds by saying, we all believe in God, we should all be allowed to coexist, and what we're trying to do is present a different kind of image of Muslims, that Muslims are good people, that they're good Americans, and so on and so forth. And you listen to Daisy Khan, there's nothing particularly controversial. It's a pretty centrist message, actually, so much so that even a right-winger like Ingram can, at the end of the interview, say, I like what you're doing. So there's no controversy. She says, I don't know anyone who would object to what you're doing. So that's all back in December of 2009. So the question is, what happened to change the terms of discussion on this issue so that it became a story entirely about insensitivity to the victims of 9/11, so that it became about how Cordoba Front was in fact an affront to the victims of 9/11. And in a nutshell, what happened is that far right-wing forces capitalized on this issue and managed to set the terms of discussion, and destruction too, actually. By far right-wing forces, I mean Tea Party people, I mean people like Pamela Geller and her organization Stop Islamization of America, as well as politicians like Newt Gingrich and Sarah Palin and so forth. And the controversy actually did not begin until May of this year. There's a really good article by the Salon reporter Justin Elliott who sort of gives a timeline of how this controversy was manufactured, and I'll sort of give you a brief overview of it. Essentially, on May 6th, the New York Community Board, by the way, voted unanimously to approve this project. And the AP, the Associated Press, wrote a story about it. It's a fairly neutral story, but it had an interview, a couple of interviews with people, victims families, saying that they might have a different kind of view. Of course, the New York Post will then take this one step further, and they ran a story titled, Panel Approves WTC Mosque, right? And Pamela Geller, the right-wing blogger, took this, of course, a million steps further in her blog, and she wrote a blog entry that day titled, quote, Monster Mosque pushes ahead in shadow of World Trade Center, Islamic death and destruction. And, in the blog post, she says, quote, this is Islamic domination and expansion. The location is no accident, just as Al-Aqsa was built on top of the temple in Jerusalem, right? So that's the tone that she wants to try to set. And of course, the very next day, her group, Stop Islamization of America, launches what they call Campaign Offensive, Stop the 9/11 Mosque. Now, of course, if you step back for a second and examine the premises of a group like Stop Islamization of America, it is completely ludicrous, right? We don't have exact counts of how many Muslims there are in the United States. The estimate is somewhere between 2 and 8 million, but one of the most authoritative studies done by the Pew Research Center says that there are 2.35 million Muslims in the US. And if you look at that as a percentage of the entire population of the United States, that's less than 1%. So even if there was such a thing as a conspiracy by Muslims to take over the United States, how less than 1% of the population might succeed in doing so, I question that. All right, so this is what starts off: campaign offensive, stop the 9/11 mosque. And the day after this protest, and the protest, by the way, was called for the end of May. Again, Pamela Geller starts blogging on this. She calls this the 9/11 monster mosque. And the New York Post, being the New York Post, picked up the story and suggested, quote, that there are better places to put the mosque, end quote. They run a few more such articles quoting Geller quite extensively, reproducing all her bile and the vitriolic rhetoric coming from her. And one article in the New York Post says, falsely by the way, that the Cordoba house was set to open on September 11th, 2011. All right? Now, this was the moment. After this article, this story spreads like wildfire, not only on Fox News and the conservative media, but even across the mainstream media. And the rhetoric, by the way, coming from the people initiating this fear-mongering is appalling, and I want to quote some of them. Again, Pamela Geller says, Muslim Americans, quote, will be attempting a political takeover, and if that doesn't work, they will turn to further intimidation, murder, and terrorism, end quote. This is what Mark Williams, a leader of the Tea Party movement, wrote on his blog. Here's how he puts it. He says, quote, the animals of Allah, for whom any day is a great day for massacre, are drooling over the positive response that they are getting from New York City officials over the proposals to build a 13-story monument to the 9/11 Muslims who hijacked those 4 airliners. The monument would consist of a mosque for the worship of the terrorist monkey god and a cultural center to propagandize the extermination of all things not approved by their cult, end quote, right? And by the way, Mark Williams apologized later, not to Muslims, but to Hindus, because, he made reference to the Hindu monkey god. All right, now here's how Newt Gingrich, this is Newt Gingrich jumping onto the bandwagon. This is how he puts it. He says, quote, Nazis don't have the right to put up a sign next to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We would never accept the Japanese putting up a site next to Pearl Harbor. There is no reason to accept a mosque right next to the World Trade Center. So what do we see here? This is an out-and-out association of all Muslims with the events of 9/11. And the logic is quite simple, right? It's all Muslims are to blame. Now, the interesting thing is that in this context, actually some media outlets did take a position against this kind of fear-mongering. So, for instance, Time magazine did its now famous cover issue where it asked the question, is America Islamophobic? And if you read that article, it's actually quite good. I mean, it has some limits, some very clear limits, which I'll come to shortly. But on the question of anti-Muslim racism, it's actually quite good. And you also see a number of mainstream liberal figures, people like Keith Olbermann, people like Jon Stewart, and so on, actually starting to do a good job of exposing the racism and the hypocrisy behind these attacks. Similarly, Chris Matthews did a couple of good shows and so forth. Now, in terms of mainstream political figures, the main figure really has been Mayor Bloomberg, the New York Mayor Bloomberg, who's come out in support of the Islamic Center. But interestingly, he was also joined by New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who also came out in support. Now, you may not know this, but Pat Buchanan, ultra-conservative Pat Buchanan, slammed Newt Gingrich. Interesting, right? He called him a political opportunist, these are his words, for actually using this issue to try to position himself in 2012 as a presidential candidate. I think what this reflects really is a bit of a debate within the GOP as to how to relate to the Tea Party movement and how to relate to the far right-wing forces. Some people think that there's political hate to be made, others want to sort of distance themselves from it. And that's why you actually saw, interestingly enough, prominent Republicans speaking out against this, but you didn't see the Democrats doing the same. To be fair, of course, President Obama did initially come out in support of the community center. And thanks to that, and thanks to the other, politicians and so forth, there was, for a period of time, a window of opportunity for people on the left to actually intervene in this debate. And in fact, socialists and activists and so on were invited to air their comments on the mainstream media. But very soon, you start to see this window beginning to shut. You start to see the space beginning to close. And I think this is in no small part because the Democrats really come out on the wrong side of the issue. That is, mainstream liberals come out on the wrong side of this issue. One after another, Democratic Party politicians spoke out against the center, from Harry Reid to the supposedly liberal Howard Dean. And President Obama, as we know, took back his endorsement by basically questioning the wisdom of the location. And what's the end result of this? Well, the end result is that public opinion showed that anywhere between 50 and 70% of the public were opposed to the project. So in other words, what do we see? The right had won. They had succeeded in setting the terms of this discussion. And let's be clear, a big part of why they succeeded is because liberal politicians caved in and let them do this. Right? So going into the demonstrations on September 11th, people may know that on September 11th, the right had called a demonstration right outside Ground Zero, a couple of blocks from Ground Zero, and progressives had called a counter demonstration closer to the Cordoba House project. So going into that, what we see is a very sort of narrow range of debate on this question. And here were the terms of the debate. It was that building the Islamic Center was insensitive, and anyone on the other side of this argument was being disrespectful to the victims' families, right? Never mind, of course, that the group September 11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows that held a vigil the previous day along with several other groups and so forth, they actually represent several hundred families. They represent the families of several hundred victims of 9/11. They have come out and taken a position in support of the community center. All those voices, of course, got conveniently missed out in this discussion. But what was completely sort of unsayable, if you will, in this context was the message that Imam Rauf himself was trying to articulate, which I said earlier, which was that building such a community center close to the ashes of the World Trade Center was intended to put a different face of Islam, one that was more representative of the 1.5 billion Muslims around the world, and to counter the kind of pernicious image that the Islamic fundamentalists, the fraction of the Muslim population, had actually succeeded in doing. That was the idea. But the problem is that this distinction between the vast majority of Muslims and the tiny minority of fundamentalists basically was completely erased. And the logic, again, I want to emphasize this, the logic of all of this is that any symbol of Islam then became offensive because, of course, all Muslims are to blame. So that's the context going into this demonstration. And I think I started with this because I think that the way that this entire controversy has played out really says a lot about the forces today who are setting the terms of discussion, where this sort of vitriolic Islamophobia is coming from, and most importantly, what we can do to counter it. So in the time that I have left, I'm going to lay out the dynamics of what allowed Cordoba House, a project, as I said earlier, that involves swimming pools and cooking lessons, to go from the benign project that it was to becoming branded the Victory Mosque, right? Those were the signs that were being carried by the far right-wing forces. Now, first and foremost, we have to be clear that the Cordoba House controversy does not mark the first instance of Islamophobia, right? The mainstream media, some mainstream liberals all seem to think, what's going on suddenly in America, that everyone has become so intolerant. Well, let's be clear that this is not the first attack that Muslims have actually seen. And if anything, this country has created a climate before 9/11, but certainly after 9/11, that has been out and out anti-Muslim. Why? Well, shortly after 9/11, President George Bush declared that the US was now involved in what he called a war on terror, right? So what did this mean? It meant that the US faced a new enemy, and this new enemy was the faceless Muslim terrorist, who, by the way, existed all over the world. And the logic is that the US could go off and fight these people wherever they lived. Didn't matter what the government of that country, thought, and so on and so forth. But this was the logic of the war on terror. There's a new enemy, and the US now has the right to go off and fight that enemy anywhere at any time. And you step back for a second, right? This is sort of the logic of the Cold War as well. We see a polarized world. On the one hand, the United States, on the other hand, the Soviet Union. And US citizens were asked to give liberty to the United States to do whatever it wants, wars in Korea and Vietnam, what have you, in order to thwart the enemy, the Soviet Union. Similarly, we were asked to give sort of carte blanche to the president to go and do whatever necessary to keep us safe from these Muslim terrorists. Now, much has been made about how shortly after 9/11, George Bush took great pains to emphasize that this was not a war on Islam and so on. But you have to actually, yes, he did say that this was not a war on Islam. But if you look at the rhetoric that they used, it was the same old kind of, Orientalist arguments that have been used at least for the last 200 years. And let me give you some examples. So in the lead up to the Afghan war, the main excuse was, to hunt down Osama bin Laden. Never mind, of course, that the Taliban actually offered to hand over Osama bin Laden. The US said, no, thank you, we'll do war instead with you. But anyway, apart from that excuse, one of the other excuses that was mobilized is that the United States was invading Afghanistan to, quote unquote, liberate Afghan women. Now, the unfortunate thing is that people in this country, including liberals and feminists, actually bought into the argument both back then and unfortunately continue to do so even now. I mentioned the Time magazine cover that had, is America Islamophobic? Unfortunately, the previous issue before that had the title, What Happens If We Leave Afghanistan? And had the image of a woman whose nose was cut off, as if to say that the US is protecting and defending women in that country, when in fact this is entirely false, right? People should read what Malalai Joya, who's an MP, an Afghan MP, has to say about this question, and she argues really convincingly that in fact this situation for the vast majority of Afghan women has deteriorated after the US invasion, and this is backed up by statistics from human rights groups and so on and so forth. So why use this argument? Well, this argument resides on the premise that Islam is an inherently misogynistic religion, and so the West must go in and rescue Muslim women. And by the way, this was not the first time this argument was used. It's been used time and time again, both by the French and by the British, and never has, the women that they've gone to rescue ever actually been rescued. But that's the insidiousness of this, that Islam is inherently violent and Muslim women need to be rescued. Let me give you a few more examples of, the ways in which Islam gets demonized. People remember the Danish cartoon controversy. This happens in 2005. Essentially, the Danish newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, prints a whole number of cartoons which are frankly quite insulting to Muslims. One that people found particularly offensive was an image of the Prophet Muhammad with a bomb strapped to his head. Right? And what's the meaning there? The meaning there is that Islam is inherently violent. It comes into being with destruction on its mind, right? Literally. And of course, when Muslims protested, when they voiced their grief about these sorts of ways in which their religion was caricatured, what was the response in the US and the West? Oh, these savages don't understand free speech. Right? They don't recognize the great democratic Western values of free speech. Never mind, of course, that there is even in the West a distinction made between hate speech and free speech. But when it comes to Muslims, apparently that term hate doesn't quite feature in the discourse. Let me give you one more example. In 2006, a United Arab Emirates company was set to take over the running of 6 US ports. And as soon as that was public knowledge, there was a huge hue and cry, right? Democrats and Republicans saying, oh my God, we can't trust these foreigners to run our ports. Of course, never mind that it was a British company that was running these ports prior to the UAE company making the bid. What's the logic here? Once again, it is UAE, Muslim country. All Muslims are suspicious characters, right? So we can't trust them to run our ports. So the dominant logic, really, both in the mainstream media and in the liberal media, is one that has been called the clash of civilizations. And I just want to speak briefly about this. The clash of civilizations argument was originally put forward by Bernard Lewis, but popularized by Samuel Huntington. And what it says, particularly, and I just want to focus in relation to us versus them, the world of Islam, and what it says is that we, in the West, we are democratic, we are enlightened, we value women's rights, we are secular, we're all things good, milk and honey and all the rest of it. Whereas they, the world of Islam, is everything bad. They are barbaric, they are uncivilized, they are undemocratic, they are violent, and so on and so forth. Now, at the time that Huntington put forward these ideas, they were actually on the margins of the political mainstream. But after 9/11, they became extremely useful because demonizing Muslims served very usefully towards forwarding the project of the war on terror. And in fact, it's because this logic has been so dominant over the last 9 years that the Cordoba House project could go from being the benign project that it was to becoming the Victory Mosque. Now, I said earlier that the clash of civilizations argument was not just to be found in the mainstream media, but also in lefty, liberal news media outlets. And let me give you a recent example of this. People may know Martin Peretz. He's the editor of the liberal magazine, The New Republic. Well, I don't know if people have read this piece, but it's a piece that, frankly, Pamela Geller, I'm sure, would be happy to post on her blog post. And, here is what he has to say. I'm reading, actually, I'm going to read the best part and then the worst part. Here's the best part. He says, quote, Muslims and Arabs do not act in America as they do in the increasingly Islamicized but non-practicing Christian and democratic sovereignties of Europe. Still, I wouldn't close my eyes or our eyes to the increasing number of both naturalized and native-born citizens who enlist in the Islamic terror networks of our time, here and abroad. Right? So that's the best part. Now he goes on to say, and this is how he ends the article, he says, but frankly, Muslim life is cheap, most notably to Muslims. And among those Muslims led by Imam Rauf, there is hardly one who has raised a fuss about the routine and random bloodshed that defines their brotherhood. So yes, I wonder whether I need to honor these people and pretend that they're worthy of the privileges of the First Amendment, which I have in my gut the sense that they will abuse. So that is the liberal New Republic editor. That's what Islamophobia looks like, right? And that's what Islamophobia has looked like over the last 9 years. It's an out-and-out vilification of Muslims, and this vilification has been constant and it's been relentless. Well, the difference today, though, is that some people in the mainstream have actually started to take a stand against it. So I don't know if people had a chance to look at Nicholas Kristof's the New York Times columnist's response to Martin Peretz. He basically attacked Peretz, for what he had written. And Peretz actually offered a sort of half-hearted apology. Now, if you go to the New Republic website, it says, I apologize for one sentence. Okay? Well, that's good. I'm glad that people like him are being called out in the pages of the New York Times. But you know what? The problem is that even though some liberal figures have come forward on the right side, there are some clear limits and problems with the arguments that are being advanced. And I want to spend a little time talking about this. The arguments that have come from liberals basically either stays at the level of quote-unquote tolerance and quote-unquote religious freedom. Nothing wrong with defending religious freedom, although I don't like the word tolerance. Who likes to be tolerated? That's, just such a nasty word to use. But anyway, so at best, the discussion stays at the level of tolerance and religious freedom, but at worst, it actually falls into the trap of national security. So in response to Terry Jones, the lunatic who called for the burning of the Quran on 9/11, in response to the burning call that he issued, everyone from President Obama on down said that this should stop, not because this is offensive and not because this is anti-Muslim, but because apparently it would put troops in harm's way. Now, it's true, we don't want our working class brothers and sisters who are serving in the military to face harm. But the problem with this argument is that it actually justifies the war on terror. It doesn't ask the question of what are the troops doing there in the first place, right? And so I think that's problematic, is, when you don't make that connection and you sort of cater to the sort of moderate, centrist kind of line, you really wind up providing a soft cover for US imperialism. And I think the key point here is that Islamophobia is not just, bad ideas in people's heads. It's not just, if people just went and met Muslims, would clear up all this prejudice. No. Islamophobia actually has a systematic structural basis, right? It exists because it serves to justify the need for war, for conquest, and for imperialism. And now, that's on the one hand, that's sort of the cause, that's sort of the immediate context for the rise of Islamophobia. I want to speak a little bit about the attacks on civil liberties and what things like the Patriot Act and other such measures have done to Muslim communities, both in the US as well as around the world. Now, as people know, and you may have read, scores of Muslims have been arrested, and they have been detained indefinitely without a trial, with being denied habeas corpus, the right to question why they have been kept in prison so long. They have been tortured, and so on and so on. And candidate Obama actually promised to put an end to this. He was against torture and so forth. But the reality, of course, is that Obama has simply continued the logic of the war on terror. He may not use that word, but he has continued the policies of the Bush administration, both abroad and right at home. If anything, he has extended the power of the executive. Last week, people may have read, a federal appeals court actually denied victims of CIA torture the right to go to court and to seek justice. And I was reading the Times article, and I want to say a little bit about it. Go check it. It was last Wednesday, front page news story. And they talk about this man, Binyam Muhammad. I don't know if you've heard of his case. He's a British resident, tortured in the most horrendous kind of way. And if anyone is squeamish here, you might want to close your ears, but don't. I think you need to know what's been going on to people in the name of self-defense, in the name of keeping Americans safe. In addition to all the torture, this is what is in the New York Times. What they did to him is they cut his penis and poured a hot and stinging liquid on it. And this man, who was let off because there's no evidence against him, is now being denied the right to have justice, to hold the people who did this to him, to some standard of justice, to some standard of fairness. So that's what's been going on, unfortunately, under the Obama administration. And most recently, of course, he ordered the execution of an American citizen, a man by the name of Anwar al-Awlaki. No due process, no presenting of evidence in the court, no having lawyers, no, innocent until proved guilty beyond all reasonable doubt, nothing of the sort. Just order his execution because we think he is associated with Al-Qaeda. And so the question that we have to ask is, why is there no hue and cry, right? And I think the answer is quite straightforward. It's because all Muslims have been seen as guilty. And so you know what? If we have to torture a few of them to get the information, so what? And anyone who's seen the show 24 knows how this logic plays out, right? The show I'm talking about. I won't say anything more about it. Now, think about the parallels here. This is exactly what they did to the Japanese, right? After World War II, after Pearl Harbor, and in the context of, decades of anti-Japanese hysteria being, sort of built up, what happened to Japanese and Japanese Americans? Over 100,000 were imprisoned and put into concentration camps. 30 years after the fact, apologies have been issued. This was a sorry chapter in American history and so on and so forth. But at the time that it was happening, at the time that all Japanese Americans were being vilified for the event of Pearl Harbor, there was very little hue and cry. And that's exactly what's happening to Muslims today. So I'll start to come to a close with this. Earlier I mentioned that some mainstream liberals have taken a position against the anti-Muslim hysteria that's being whipped up. That's good, but I think what's even better is that ordinary people have grown disgusted with this kind of scapegoating and have come forward to organize against it. So ordinary people from Tennessee to Gainesville to Staten Island have come out to support their Muslim brothers and sisters, and most recently I believe the count was that 3,000 of us were at the September 11th demonstration, which is far greater than the people who were on the other side. So I think we can really take confidence from this and press ahead to organize around this issue. But I think in doing so, we can take a few lessons from past movements that have successfully fought against racism. I started off by talking about, how benign the Cordoba House project is. And in some ways, the parallels are not exact, but in some ways I look at this like what Martin Luther King, the Reverend Martin Luther King and others were trying to do back in 1955 in Montgomery, when Rosa Parks famously, for the nth time, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. And the bus boycott that was called by the young Reverend Martin Luther King and so on had very modest demands. What did they ask for? They didn't ask for an end to segregation. They simply said, treat us politely and don't ask us to get up when white customers come onto the bus. But even that was too much for the white racist establishment. King was not only verbally attacked, he was physically attacked in this context. And I think there are parallels here to what Imam Rauf is trying to do. It's not the same, and certainly I don't want to equate the experience of what it's like for people to be brought here on chains across the Atlantic with the experience of American Muslims. Although I must say there's a real deep irony here, because 35% of Muslims are African Americans. So talk about a double hit for some people. But without going into too much details about the similarities and differences, I just want to draw two quick lessons from the civil rights movement that I think are relevant to us. King and the SCLC and other people in the civil rights movement start to learn over the course of the struggle that what may seem to be modest and reasonable demands really don't get the movement very far. And so what they do is they realize that they have to expose the systematic nature of Jim Crow segregation, and they have to ask for nothing short of ending segregation. Today, I think we face a similar challenge, and what we need to do is to show that Islamophobia is also similarly a systematic kind of prejudice, and it's based in the system of war and imperialism. Two, the climate for Muslims today is really horrific, right? I mean, people have been reading about the cab driver, the New York cab driver, who was asked if he was a Muslim and then attacked and slashed and so forth. You've probably also read about the arson attempts in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. You've heard about gunshots being fired outside a mosque in New York. You've heard about Qurans being burnt and so forth. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it's pretty scary and stressful to be a Muslim at this point in the United States. But I think we can take away from the civil rights movement the lesson that if we build a movement, we can actually succeed in countering the kind of vitriol and bile that we're seeing today. And I really want to emphasize building a movement, because what the last few weeks have shown us is that we can't rely on the Democrats to do the right thing. We can't rely on people in positions of power to do the right thing. Just one quick example. People may know of the group New York Neighbors for American Values. Consists of many religious organizations, the ACLU and so on and so forth. They're the folks who call the vigil the previous day. Some of the organizers, I heard, were trying to get mainstream politicians to come and speak. Their message was very benign. They weren't even saying Islamophobia or racism. They're just saying we're standing up for American values and so forth. But they couldn't get one mainstream politician to come out there and take a stand. And I went and checked to see were they successful. I went and checked on their website, not one mainstream politician listed as a speaker. So I think there are very important lessons here, and that is that if we want to fight Islamophobia, we have to do it, right? We have to build a movement based on rallies, based on educational events like this, based on marches and so forth, and we have to make our position very clear. Muslims will not sit at the back of the bus anymore. We will not sit silent when they are tortured, when bombs are rained on their country. We are going to say quite clearly and definitively no to wars abroad and no to wars at home. Thank you. Come back and hit on some of the points. I can't possibly take everything up. But I'll start with the question of whether Islamophobia is a form of racism, and it's actually a form of cultural racism. And let me explain why I think it's a form of cultural racism. I mean, first of all, Muslims are not a race, right? Neither are African Americans, neither are Caucasians, or anybody else for that matter. The idea that people who have certain biological features fall into a particular race is a historically new concept, right? Genetically, if you look at the similarities between people within a race, there are more similarities between people across races genetically than there is within a race. So there's no real biological basis for the concept of race. So the question is, where does this construct, where does this notion come from? Well, it's historically new. It comes about in the context, really, of two developments in Europe. One, and the Americas. One is slavery, and the other is colonialism, right? Because what's happening in Europe is it's going through a period that's known as the Enlightenment. Ideas such as equality, right? The French Revolution puts forward the idea that we're all equal, we should have democracy, we should have voting, and so on and so forth. In that context, how do you justify enslaving a whole continent of people and making them work for you? Right? If you believe in ideas, if your constitution says that all men are equal, and of course they meant only men, how do you justify it? How do you justify going off and conquering another people and robbing their resources if all human beings are equal? And so this ideology of race, this notion that human beings fit into different kinds of races, and furthermore, some are superior and others are inferior, and the role of the superior races is to go off and civilize the inferior races. That's the context in which it comes in, right? And so discrimination against whole groups of people is about 200-300 years old. Just very quickly on the history of Muslims as a race, it goes back actually a little bit before that. When the Iberian Peninsula, which includes Spain and Portugal and so on, was under the rule of the Abbasid dynasty. This was when, Europe was in the Dark Ages. The Abbasid dynasty, actually what they did is they collected all the great works of human, science, from all over the world and so on, translated it, and there's a great period of growth and so on that took place. Cordoba actually was one of the centers of cultural learning where there was massive increases in knowledge having to do with, architecture and science and art and so on. That's why these people have taken that name, not only because Jews, Muslims, and Christians coexisted, but human civilization as a whole saw a boost forward. Okay. In response to this, the papacy, the Pope, organized Europe in the form of a reconquest to get rid of the Muslim invaders and so forth. And the first thing that they did is they came up with something called the blood purity laws, where they said because Jews have a different kind of blood than Christians, they are automatically a race and they don't belong here. And they used that justification to fuel the Christians in this context of the reconquest to get rid of the Jews. Then they used the exact same argument against the Muslims. So that's how, religion becomes a race in the context of the struggle for power, colonization, reconquest, and so on and so forth. So I think today nobody sees Muslims as a biological race, but there is a kind of cultural racism going on. That is, any symbol of Islam is automatically seen as offensive, right? The veil, for instance, is seen as offensive. Mosques are seen as offensive, and so on and so forth. These people just don't fit into our society, right? That's the way the logic works. In terms of the whether Imam Rauf and Daisy Khan are going to, switch the location, there certainly has been tremendous pressure on them to do that. Patterson has said that he will give state property to actually build this and so on and so forth. But everything that I've seen them say so far is they understand the stakes here, and they don't want to move it. I may disagree with the way that Imam Rauf put it on his interview on Larry King Live. He said, national security is at stake and so on and so forth. But the fact is they get this is going to be, a huge blow to our side and will only embolden the forces of the right and so on. So I think we've got to continue to make this argument. We've got to say, look, this is a very slippery slope that we're on. If we say, fine, move it 10 blocks away, what about the existing mosque that is 4 blocks away? Should we demolish that? And then what about all the other mosques that are in New York City or are in the neighborhoods where the victims of 9/11's families actually live? Should we demolish that? And so what we're leading towards is really, a complete sort of demonization of Muslims. So we've got to stand our ground, and I hope that everything that they have said so far, they will stick to and not move the location of Cordoba House. In terms of, the first question that was asked, does the left address the real fear that people have, when they see, for instance, the Christmas bomber, as he was called, or the guy who tried to set off a bomb in Times Square and so on. I mean, first of all, if we step back for a second, these are really pathetic attempts at terrorism. This guy who was responsible for the Times Square bombing, I think he left his keys in some getaway car and so on. The whole operation was completely slipshod. It didn't go through, so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is, of course, these things are real. But I don't think the fear is real. I think that the fear is manufactured to create an enemy that can be mobilized against. Let me just give some statistics, and this is not just the left. Even the right, the Rand Corporation put out an editorial a couple of months ago saying that actually terrorism-related incidents have been going down. All the experts have said it's been going down since 2005, and even Rand, the right-wing institution, is willing to admit that Americans are more likely to die from car accidents and things like that than they are from terror-related events. And I think on the left, we've got to expand that discussion and say, more people die from a lack of health insurance. More people die from things like workplace-related safety issues, right? And we've seen that all around us in the form of mine disasters, explosions at industries, and so on and so forth. We've got to continue to say, let's put the focus on what the real threat is and take it off this fictitious, mythical threat that people are asked to fear. And I think it's in that context as well that I want to speak to the question of McCarthyism. I think what has happened in the United States, particularly since last October, when Major Nidal Hassan, who you mentioned, took a Ghanaian, the army psychiatrist who killed 13 of his co-workers and then killed himself and so on. Since then, these instances of a handful of people, maybe a dozen or more, has occupied mainstream media attention in such a way that I think we're seeing sort of a new green scare. At least I've used that term. The term has already been taken by the environmental movement, but I think it applies really more here because it functions exactly like the Red Scare, right? Because what's the discourse? What's the rhetoric around this? It's, there are these people all over. They're underneath the chairs. They're in your bathroom. Be very, very scared. And I think the hysteria was most prominent when this woman, Jihad Jain, I don't know if you caught the news around this, but this blonde, green-eyed woman, Philadelphia suburbanite, was alleged to be involved in some sorts of terror-related activities, and the hysteria was amazing. They're all around us, these greens who can come out, and so what's the message here? It's be scared of all these people around you, and turn them in, and so forth. And honestly, that's how the Red Scare functioned. But just on the question of bad Muslim and good Muslim, I think that was an absolutely good point. I think we have to take that conversation even deeper, right? The people who today we are being asked to fear, the bad Muslims, actually used to be good Muslims back during the Cold War. That is to say that the United States allied with all of the far right-wing forces in the Middle East, in South Asia, in North Africa, and so on, because they wanted them to serve as a counter to the very popular secular nationalist forces that existed in these countries. There are dozens of examples, I'll just give two. But in 1953, when the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, what did they do? They got street, mobs. They got people to come out into demonstrations. Who did they get to do that? Well, it was Ayatollah Khomeini's mentor, Kashani, who was responsible for getting the forces out. He was given money, support, backing, and so in some ways, the CIA sets the basis that allows Khomeini and others to come to power in the context of the 79 revolution. Of course, the most famous example is US support for the holy warriors, as they were called, the Mujahideen, in Afghanistan. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 79, the US spent billions of dollars training and arming the Mujahideen, and it's out of them that Al-Qaeda comes into being. Osama bin Laden was a CIA asset. He was toured around the Middle East to recruit for the Mujahideen and so forth. And in fact, the way that some people who write about this say is that, if you actually look at the Islamists, the radicals who today we are taught to fear, they were actually a tiny minority in every single country. What did the Afghan war serve to do, or rather, what did the US serve to do? It brought these people together. It trained them in all sorts of deadly skills, how to set off bombs, how to kill people, all sorts of things, trained them in the use of sophisticated machinery, created an army and united these people, and then sent them back. So that when they go back to Algeria, they go back to Egypt, they go back to Saudi Arabia, and they escalate the tactics in their country thanks to the training care of the US taxpayer. So, we need to tell the whole story of what's been going on and look at, this rhetoric of good Muslim, bad Muslim, and finally, relentless and vicious, over the last couple of years. And I think that, the problem is that it's not the problem. The thing is that the same forces who are whipping up hatred against Muslims are also the forces who are whipping up hatred against Latino immigrants. And the problem is that today, in the context of what is turning out to be a prolonged recession, we are still, I just heard on NPR, we are still at 9.6% unemployment. The problem is that these forces actually have some grounds to recruit for their cause. And so in some ways, we really have our job cut out for us in terms of showing the connections between all the right-wing groups and showing how in the context of crisis, they can actually advance their agenda and so forth. And let's not forget that Hitler's ideas become prominent only after the Great Depression, right? After the stock market crash and so on. I'm not saying we're there, but I'm saying that that's the potential. And so I'll end with this. Someone mentioned Geert Wilders. I don't know if people have had a chance to read about who this man is. He was invited by Pamela Geller to be one of the featured speakers on September 11th. They're big fans. Pamela Geller's a big fan of his. And this man is one of the most vicious Islamophobes that you can ever come across. BBC had this amazing interview with him a couple of weeks ago. He is someone who basically thinks that Islam is like fascism. The Quran is the equivalent of Mein Kampf. He thinks that Islamic civilization, and I'm using his word, is retarded. And so he wants to stop immigration of not just Muslims from Muslim-majority countries, but anyone from Muslim-majority countries, because these retards could come and dilute the greatness of the West. So that's who this guy is, right? He wants to ban the veil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he was the one who was invited. Well, the problem is that if you look at his trajectory and you look at his history, and the BBC, does a good job of this, is when he first proposed the veil ban, Holland, liberal, left of center and so on, the parliament was just laughing at him. They weren't taking him seriously. Right-wing kook, we shouldn't bother about him. And one of the responses by one of the Dutch politicians was to say, sure, I'll support your veil ban, but you need to support my tax on bleached blonde hair because that's bad for the environment. And everyone breaks out into laughter, right? Because that's how seriously or not seriously they took this guy. Well, the problem is that today, his party got the second largest votes in the recent elections, and he stands to come to power, most likely. I haven't checked off late, but he stands to come to power in a coalition government. Think of what that means, right? And the reason I bring this up is not to say that the US is poised on the brink of, a right-wing takeover or anything. In fact, the New York Times this morning, I don't know if people had a chance to read the polls, people, yes, are disappointed with the Democrats, but they're even more disappointed with the Republicans. So I'm not sure, whether this is going to be, we'll talk about that later. But suffice it to say, the reason I bring up Geert Wilders is because if we don't challenge these kind of people right now, if we don't challenge every single attempt made by the right to shut down a mosque, to threaten people, and so on and so forth, that's the potential that exists down the road. So I think we have our work cut out for us. This has been a great discussion and a great meeting, but we need to take these ideas outside of this sphere and talk to our friends, our neighbors, our family members and co-workers and so on, and continue this movement.